Well, thank you. Certainly nonpartisan civil servants must be hired and they must be retained because of their ability to actually do the job effectively based on objective performance standards, and those standards stay in place regardless of who is serving as the president. So my question for you, Ms. Duke, is compared to appointees who serve at the pleasure of the president, what role do civil servants play in helping a presidential administration secure the border, respond to natural disasters, as well as defend against threats from abroad?
I would say there's two principal roles in regard to the topic of this hearing. One is to inform policy. So with years of experience, I think that it's important for civil servants to understand the policy objective and help inform it so it can be tailored to be most effective. The second role that civil servants have is executing the policy, and I think that's tied to the first because we learn a lot through execution of policy. So what works and what doesn't work. So if we have a policy on constructing a physical barrier, like you said, Senator, how can that be done effectively? And what things do we have to consider in doing that? So I think it's an informing and an executing role.
Were there national security issues or natural disasters during your time in the federal government where you especially relied on career civil servants to help and develop a response? Could you give us an example? This may come to mind.
Yes, consistently, both as a senior executive service career, relying on junior people, but then also as a two-time political appointee. One example was I was at the start of President Obama's administration, we had H1N1, which was the first COVID, if you will, never came to the extent. And really talking to the civil servants about what can we do to prevent the spread in Homeland Security, the use of personal protective equipment, how do we deal with antibiotics, but really having to understand the workforce and how we could stop the spread of this. Another example more recently, when I was back in government, is making decisions on temporary protective status. Not only what's the letter of the law in terms of deciding whether to extend temporary protective status, but what implications could that have across other areas of government so that we make the right decision, but also deploy that decision, if you will, in the most effective way.
Very good. Mr. Levine, what types of risk from the U.S. defense of perspective would be heightened if the department lost access to the expertise that is unique with career civil servants?
Well, there's really nothing that the department does that it does without, other than actual operations on the battlefield, nothing that it does without the direct involvement of civilian employees. And even on the battlefield, you have employees in a supporting role. So the logistics systems of the department, the communication systems of the department, the acquisition systems of the department, the personnel systems of the department, all run with a substantial input by the expertise of the civilians. If you didn't have that expertise, you'd be hard pressed to get our service members paid. You'd have hard pressed to get their families taken care of, and you'd be hard pressed to equip and train our soldiers so they could operate in the field. So there is no aspect of the department's operations that does not have civilians, DoD civilians embedded in it, and that relies on deep expertise. And you could put in other people to do it, but without the expertise that you have there now, I worry that the functioning would not be as good. It would start with the budget process. The budget process, putting together a budget in the Department of Defense, an $800, $900 billion budget, is an incredibly complex process. And we tend to think at a political level of a few major issues that overarch, that have heavy political weight, but there is a lot of detail going down to going down to the $100,000, $10,000 level and putting together the pieces and making sure they fit together. And again, civilians play absolutely critical role in that process. And without their expertise, I don't know that you'd be able to fund the department.
Well, I just follow up on that. It's important to put in perspective the Department of Defense is the largest federal agency in the U.S. government, and it employs, this is the number, 700,000 civilian employees, a massive organization. So my question for you, and you raised this in your opening comments, in your experience in leadership roles at the Department of Defense, including as the principal advisor on personnel policy and management, did you personally experience or observe career civil servants acting in a partisan way to block the president's political goals?
I never saw that happen, no, sir.
Ms. Duke, the Department of Homeland Security is the third largest cabinet department in the U.S. government. And my question for you is, in your experience as Deputy Secretary and Acting Secretary during a Republican administration, to what extent did you observe insubordination by civilian public servants?
I did not observe that by our civil servants.
Mr. Devine, whistleblowers play an integral role in providing oversight for the federal government, ensuring that fraud, waste, and abuse is identified, and certainly I think all of us on this committee understand the importance of whistleblowers and continually work to protect their status. So my question to you is, to what extent do you think converting civil servants to appointees serving at the will of a president's political leadership would actually impact the willingness of whistleblowers to come forward? I know you talked about this in your opening comments, but I think it's important to really drill down as to what that impact will be.
Mr. Chairman, I think some examples might be helpful to illustrate their impact. Whistleblowers at the Department of Defense stopped the routine purchase of the world's most expensive nuts, bolts, toilet seats, coffee pots, and other items that were purchased. They stopped blanket domestic surveillance, working through the Department of Defense Office of Inspector General in sparking passage of the USA Freedom Act. They forced delivery of mine-resistant vehicles that have been held up due to political obstruction and reduced the number of fatalities, which were 90% in Iraq and Afghanistan, and 60% casualties from landmines to 5% casualties from landmines. They prevented the federal air marshals, for example, from going AWOL during a confirmed, more ambitious al-Qaeda rerun of 9/11 back in 2003. They prevented the trillion-dollar next phase of Star Wars after the Army's chief scientist, a career employee, exposed that that billion-dollar investment would have been irrelevant for the nation's defense. Over and over again, they've changed the course of history. And they couldn't have done this without the Merit System's freedom of speech.
Thank you. Senator